All right. Hello, seventh grade. We are going to continue with our study of chapter 12. So I know I've assigned chapter 13 already as far as reading section 1 and doing the CYP. So these next two videos are going to finish up chapter 12 for us. So right now we're in the middle of chapter 12, section 3. The last thing we talked about was how the emperor moved the capital of Japan from Nara to Kyoto. Right? By the way, what do they eat for breakfast in Kyoto? Anybody know? Japan cakes. That's a funny joke. All right, good. I'm sure if you guys were here in the classroom, you'd all be rolling on the floor with laughter right now. You're probably doing that at home while you're watching this, so you're welcome. All right. Anyways, with that out of the way, we are going to talk about the decline of the emperor in Kyoto. Right, so this is midway through section 3 of chapter 12. Yes. All right. So in Kyoto, the emperors had a lot of power. They lived in great wealth and luxury. There's a lot of cultural development in Kyoto. But around the 800s, and the reasons for this you don't need to know, around the 800s, the emperor started to lose some of its power to a very powerful Japanese family called the Fujiwara. So the Fujiwara were an old Japanese family that had lived in great wealth and power for centuries in Japan. And when the capital got moved, the Fujiwara benefited from this, and they got to live in close proximity to the emperor in Kyoto. So, in fact, within the span of about 50 years, the Fujiwara had basically taken all of the emperor's power away from him and basically made him into a puppet. Right? They kind of just controlled the emperor like a puppet because the Fujiwara family had all the real power. Right? So here's how the Fujiwara did this. They would convince, because they had the most power and they had a lot of wealth, they would have their daughters marry into the emperor's family. Right? So if Sebastian is the emperor and Sophia's a daughter of the Fujiwara family, right? Sophia's father would make a deal with Sebastian and have Sophia marry into Sebastian's family. So if Sebastian has a son, for example, or a nephew, Sophia would marry that son, right? And when Sophia and that son have a child, that child would be raised by Sophia's family, not Sebastian's family. So the male children in the emperor's family were raised by the mothers, and the mothers always came from the Fujiwara clan, right? From the Fujiwara family. So the children were taken out of the emperor's family and raised by the Fujiwara family. And what would happen is, because these children grew up in the Fujiwara households, they would have a lot of loyalty and connection to their mother and their mother's family. Right? And so when the child would grow up, the Fujiwara would convince the emperor Sebastian to step down from power, and Sebastian's nephew or son, who has been raised by the Fujiwara, would take his place. Well, the child that takes Sebastian's place would be too young to actually rule. So in place of this child actually ruling over Japan, a male member of the Fujiwara family, maybe Sophia's father or brother or something like that, would become something called a regent, right? A regent until Sophia's son became old enough to rule. So a regent, that's a word you need to know, is a person who is appointed to basically be a temporary ruler, right? So if a ruler is too young to rule or is sickly or incapacitated in some way, the regent is sort of the person who steps in as a substitute, right? So regents have tremendous, tremendous power in Japan, and this makes the Fujiwara family more powerful than the family of the emperor. All right, so the regent would step in until the child grows up and is old enough to rule. And then as soon as another member of the emperor's family marries a female from the Fujiwara family and they have a son, then Sophia's son steps down from power and another Fujiwara-raised member of the emperor's family becomes emperor. Right? And so the cycle continued for a few generations until the Fujiwara family completely take over. Right? So they marry their daughters, Fujiwara marry their daughters, they marry their nieces into the imperial family. And because of Japanese culture, the sons would be raised by the mother and the mother's side of the family, not the father and the father's side of the family. So this is how the Fujiwara took power away. All right. So under the control of Fujiwara, that means Japan is no longer under the control of the imperial family. The Fujiwara were very skillful rulers, so Japan was able to remain united even though the people outside of Kyoto knew that they were obeying the Fujiwaras now, not the actual emperor. So one big difference that the Fujiwara brought into Japan was that they further isolated it from other countries, especially China. Because by 900, China was objectively inferior to Japan in terms of its power, wealth, development, scholarship, art, literature. Right? China was inferior in almost every way to Japan around the year 900. So the Fujiwara stopped sending people to China entirely. Outside the capital, however, because the emperor is not around, even though the Fujiwara are really powerful, a lot of other clans start to believe that maybe they can do something like the Fujiwara did and sort of struggle for power against each other. And there's two families that arise called the Taira and the Minamoto families. And each of these families raises a massive army. They begin to fight each other, and that even though they're fighting each other during different periods of time, they also work together to overthrow the Fujiwara. Right? These very wealthy families outside of Kyoto are very jealous of the Fujiwara. They don't think the Fujiwara are legitimate leaders of Japan, and they understand the Fujiwara basically turned the emperor into a puppet, and they want to take power away from the Fujiwara. Right? So these armies that are raised are made up of warriors called samurai. Samurai are deeply, deeply loyal to their clans. They're not loyal to the emperor. They're not loyal to the Fujiwara. They're not loyal to Japan. They're not even loyal to their own families. They are loyal to their clan leaders. Right? That is where their primary loyalty lies. This is going to be a big advantage for these families that are able to afford to have samurai. All right, so together the Taira and the Minamoto families are able to drive the Fujiwara out of Kyoto eventually. And then once the Fujiwara are gone, the Taira and the Minamoto families fight each other to fill the power vacuum and see who gets to be in control of Japan. Right? Now remember, the emperor is still in place, but the emperor has no power at all. Right? The emperor has been supported by the Fujiwara family for a really long time. Fujiwaras are gone. The emperor is really weak. Nobody listens to the emperor. It's the Taira and the Minamoto families battling it out to see who's going to control Japan. So these two families fight for decades. And eventually it's the Minamoto family that's going to win out. Right? The Minamoto family raid Kyoto, and they burn down the emperor's palace, and they force the emperor and his family to flee. Right? Let's fast forward a little bit. So the emperor is in hiding. The Minamoto family are basically in control of Japan, but the Taira family are still fighting. 1185, there's a boy emperor. He has a mother and a grandmother. There's no father. We don't know what happened to the father. He's been driven away from Kyoto, and they try to make an alliance with the Taira family. Because remember, it's the Minamoto family that burned down their palace and drove them away. So they make an alliance with the Taira family, and they try to give what little support they can to the Tairas. So they're on a Taira ship on the sea. Well, the Minamoto find out that the emperor is on board this ship. Now, the emperor has three symbols of imperial power that a lot of people in Japan still think are significant, right? These are called the mirror, the sword, and the jewel. And these are probably just three symbolic objects that the emperor's family possessed that symbolized his authority over Japan as emperor. So even though he didn't actually have any real power as emperor, these were important symbols of power that the family possessed. And the Minamoto hear that the emperor and these symbols are on board this Taira ship, and they want these symbols for themselves. That way they could solidify their authority over Japan, and who knows, maybe make a member of the Minamoto clan the new emperor. So they attack the Taira ship. It immediately becomes very clear that the Minamoto ship is going to board the Taira ship and arrest or execute everyone on board. And the grandmother of the boy emperor does not want her enemies to get a hold of the sword, the mirror, and the jewel. And so she grabs the boy emperor, grabs the mirror, sword, and jewel, and she jumps overboard into the sea and kills them both. And they die. And the mirror, sword, and jewel are lost forever. Right? So yes, she committed suicide and killed her grandson, in order to prevent her enemies from getting power. So the emperor's dead. The mirror, the sword, and the jewel are lost at sea. And now the Minamoto family has the emperor out of the way, and they can basically rule Japan essentially unchallenged. I mean, there are other families who are still going to challenge their power, but the Minamotos are the biggest and baddest of them all. And the leader of the Minamoto family at this time is a guy named Minamoto Yoritomo, who is going to be the effective ruler of Japan. But he can't be the emperor because the mirror, sword, and jewel are lost. So he knows he can't be the emperor. And so instead, he takes the title of shogun. Oh, by the way, another reason that he can't be the emperor is because of the Constitution of the 12 Articles, if you remember that. Right? There's a reason that Minamoto Yoritomo can't be the emperor in the Constitution of the 12 Articles. I won't tell you that now. See if you can think of it in your head, though. So he decides, I can't be emperor, I'm going to be shogun instead. So shogun is a title from ancient Japan that means supreme military leader, right? It was basically like a military figure. It was not a political figure. But Minamoto Yoritomo decides to repurpose the title of shogun to effectively mean king or ruler of Japan. Right? It was supposed to be a temporary position that the emperor grants, but Minamoto Yoritomo gives it an entirely new meaning, meaning basically, I am the permanent ruler of Japan. I have replaced the emperor. So under the shogun's rule, Japan becomes very, very unstable, and violence breaks out. There's lawlessness everywhere. And to try to maintain law and order, we see again a surge of feudalism. Right? So the daimyo, which are the local landowning lords, offer protection to the peasants in exchange for their property, their land, and their labor. This again creates a system of feudalism. All right. So feudalism is a new social order. It's a system of land ownership in which there's a lord who grants possession of land and other rewards in exchange for labor or military service. All right. And actually, we're going to stop here because I am almost out of time with this video. So I'll pick up later.